Okay, so for a really quick TLDR, for my tank in particular, the nitrate is sitting at 4 and the phosphate is sitting at 0.1. Well, today's 0.2, but 0.1 seems to be where things are happy. But if you want to see how the corals actually reacted, let's take a look. Hey Reefers, so as I mentioned, the first part of the 45-gallon tank revamp is going to be nutrients. So when I mention nutrient, it's basically what the corals intake. We're not talking about light. We're talking about nitrate, phosphate, and amino acid. The tricky thing about coral nutrient is that you do not want to have too much where you get like an algae bloom. But at the same time, you also don't want to have none where the corals starve and possibly die. And sometimes it's tricky to determine where the fine line is. And there's this thing called the Redfield ratio. It is what the ocean's value is between phosphate, nitrate, and also carbon. And since I'm just exploring this issue myself, I'm definitely not the right person to really talk about it. So I'm gonna turn it over to my friend, Javi Sai, who is the residential scientist slash wizard, however you want to look at it. To me, he's more like a wizard. Let's go.
What's up, Inappropriate Reefer? Hobby Sci here. I heard that you were trying to achieve the Redfield ratio in your aquarium in order to control nuisance algae. I personally have seen some papers here and there suggesting that there is some benefit in keeping the Redfield ratio. I personally don't have any data or experience keeping the Redfield ratio. I do, however, want to give you some tips in achieving a specific nitrogen to phosphorus ratio in your tank. A lot of people think that you can do nitrate to phosphate and just compare your ppm in order to get to the Redfield ratio. That's just not true. You basically have to consider a couple of things in order to get the right ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus. For example, if you had 100 marbles of nitrate, NO3, only about 25 of those marbles are going to be nitrogen. And in 100 marbles of phosphate, PO4, only about 20 of those are going to be phosphorus. There's a couple other pieces to the puzzle that you have to work with, basically how much each atom weighs or what mass the atom is. I don't want to explain all that math right now, but I've already done it, and in order to get 16:1 ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus in your tank, you want to keep your nitrate ppm to phosphate ppm 10.5 to 1. Or roughly 10 to 1. That'll give you the 16:1 ratio that you're looking for nitrogen to phosphorus. For example, in your reef tank, if you have 2 ppm nitrate, you'll want to keep roughly 0.2 ppm phosphate. I personally dose both nitrate and phosphate to my tank, and I would say that my corals are definitely looking happier when there's some detectable levels of nutrients in the system. I use my GHL dosers to dose just a little bit consistently throughout the day, multiple times a day, and I'd say that the results have been pretty positive for me. Anyways, good luck on your quest in keeping the Redfield ratio. I'm curious to see what you find.
Whoa, hold on a second, my Asian brother. Did you just say you don't want to do all those math? I would like to see how the conversion actually works, so I would love to dive into how you converted phosphate to phosphorus. To piggyback right on that question, one big question I have is that a lot of people online seem to recommend the henna phosphorus checker versus the phosphate checker because the phosphorus checker is parts per billion versus the phosphate is parts per million. The argument is that the phosphorus checker has a higher resolution, thus more accurate. I'm wondering if that is true, and between the two checkers, is there one that you recommend if I want to keep track of low nutrient in my reef tank?
That's a pretty good question. Let me try to explain. The short answer is one measures phosphate in parts per million and another one measures phosphorus in parts per billion. Now, if you're not a chemistry expert, that might be kind of confusing, so let me try to show you what I mean. The phosphate meter actually measures PO4, or total phosphate concentration in your water, in parts per million, and the phosphorus meter only reads the green portion, the phosphorus component. A group of phosphate molecules, or a mole, in those 31 grams will be phosphorus and 64 grams will be oxygen. If you sum those up, you'll get 95 grams per mole. What this means is that the ratio of phosphate to phosphorus is 3.06. That means you can convert your reading from your phosphor meter and your phosphate meter back and forth with the ratio of 3.06. Let me give you an example of what that means. If your phosphorus meter reads 50 parts per billion, you can multiply that number by 3.06 and you'll get your phosphate reading, as in 153 parts per billion, which is the same thing as 0.15 parts per million. Common misconception is that the phosphate meter, which reads in parts per million, is 1,000 times less accurate than the phosphorus meter. That's not true. If you look at the minimum reading on the phosphate meter, it's 0.01 parts per million. If you divide that number by 3, you'll actually end up getting 3 parts per billion phosphorus, which is only 3 times the lowest reading of the phosphorus meter. Now, if I were to give a recommendation on any of these meters, I would definitely recommend the phosphate meter to someone who is trying to get a better idea of what's happening in your reef tank. Mainly because the conversation in the reefing hobby, it mainly revolves around the phosphate number. Rarely do we ever talk about the phosphorus number. So instead of having to convert your numbers when you're talking to someone about your phosphate levels, you can just get the phosphate meter and get the reading directly, and you can use that number to discuss with your friends about what your phosphate levels are. Now, seeing as the lowest reading on the phosphate meter being 0.01 parts per million phosphate, and that being equivalent to 3 parts per billion phosphorus, I have a strong suspicion that both of these meters are actually the exact same thing. And actually, if you look on the back of both of these boxes, it says that both of the meters use the same method for measuring phosphorus or phosphate, which is the ascorbic acid method. You can Google what that is if you really want to know what the explanation is, but basically, I have a strong suspicion that these 2 packets contain the exact same reagent, and both of these meters are actually reading the exact same thing. One is just dividing or multiplying the number by 3. I hope that answered your question. Feel free to stop by my channel if you have any other questions about the reefing hobby.
So now that I know what value I'm shooting for, there are these 3 test kits that I use regularly these days as I dial things in. Number 1, for the chemistry portion, I check my alkalinity with the Henna checkers, but this is for another video. For coral nutrient, I check with my NIOS nitrate test kit. I really like the NIOS one because it's really easy to perform and the result is pretty clear compared to some of the other ones I got. For phosphates, I use the Henna checker phosphates ULR. I know some people also use the phosphorus ULR. The value I get is what I'll use. I don't need to do any math for conversion. So these are the 2 that I check. And how often I check is that maybe every 3 days, or if I dose any liquid nitrate or liquid phosphate, after 24 hours, I would check to see what the level is so I can kind of determine the amount of intake by the corals.
5 minutes later.
Now we're waiting for the results of the nitrate test. I'm not going to do a whole walkthrough on how to do the test because it's basically in the instruction right here and there's a lot of videos online for it, but I will share the results that I get and what I do with it. I've been tweaking my nutrient level for about 3 to 4 weeks now in the tank, so I've been doing this for a while. And I do see really positive response from the corals, so I think it's totally worth it. It is definitely one thing that I have not done in the past that I totally should have. So I'm really glad that I caught on to this before I moved on to the 150-gallon tank, because this is a big portion of a reef tank, a coral health. For example, the Manipur cap is kind of my indicator of a low-level nutrient. Whenever it gets a little bit pale, I'm like, okay, something is off of the tank. Usually that means the phosphate is low. When my zoas close up, usually that's an indicator that the phosphate is high. So I do have indicator corals that I look at in my tank. But until I start really testing these days, I don't have the complete picture. I kind of guess what's going on, and I was right in terms of what's high and what's low, but I don't know exactly how high and how low and how to adjust it. So while we wait for the nitrate test value, let me talk about how I adjust it. So first of all, these are from Fish of Hex, another fantastic YouTuber in the reefing community. These are not sponsored. I just think these are great products and a good price. Hey guys, sorry about that. Battery died, but figure I'll just pick it up later on. So we're now about 5 weeks into this nutrient experiment, and I have been keeping track and adjusting, and I think I got a pretty good grasp on it. Right now, we're just kind of waiting on the Henna phosphate checker to finish checking today's value. But let me just finish my thought before we finish the phosphate check. So before the battery died, we were talking about Fisher Pack's awesome products right here. I use these to adjust the nitrate. I use this to adjust the phosphate. Surprisingly, the nitrate has been really consistent. It's been sitting at 4 and it's just not budging. So whatever I'm feeding the tank, it has been sustainable in terms of keeping nitrate at that level. In terms of phosphate, I did have to dose. If I were to go for the actual red field ratio, with a nitrate of 4, phosphate should be sitting at about 0.4, but I feel like the tank looks pretty happy with 0.1, which is what it has been measuring for the past couple weeks. So I figure, okay, let's just keep it at 0.1. I mean, even though hitting the red field ratio, which is the natural seawater's level, is great, but if the tank looks good, let's just keep it there, because 0.4 phosphate sounds kind of high to me. So I'm just gonna keep it here. It's kind of offset, but we'll see how it looks long term. Oh, here we go. I think the checker's ready. 0.22, that's interesting. Actually, no. You know what? I think I understand why. Yesterday I fed a lot of frozen food, and so probably that bumped up the phosphate a little bit too. But it's surprising because I did not dose phosphate. Oh, You know what? It's actually a good thing I checked, because today I was ready to dose a little bit of phosphate. I was convinced I need some phosphate. As we can see from the result, it's actually 0.22. So it tells you how important testing is. As I was saying, 0.1 thing seems happy. Ideally, if I were to hit the red field ratio, it should be 0.4. So 0.2, I can live with it. Let's just let it sit there and simmer, and then we'll see how it goes. Okay, so for a really quick TLDR, for my tank in particular, the nitrate is sitting at 4, and the phosphate is sitting at 0.1. Well, today's 0.2, but 0.1 seems to be where things are happy. But if we really want to go for the red field ratio, it'll be nitrate at 4 and the phosphate at 0.4, which is a little bit high for my taste. But since everything is pretty happy with nitrate at 4 and phosphate at 0.1 or 0.2, I'm okay with that. And I think I'm going to insert this in the beginning of the video. So for people who just want to see the value, they can see it right off the bat without sitting through the whole thing. But if you want to see how the corals actually reacted, let's take a look. Oh, by the way, if you're wondering about acceptable levels, here, we're gonna refer back to Travis Fisher Pack's bottles right here. Right off the bat, you see that for nitrate, he recommends between 3 to 5 ppm, and for phosphates, he recommends between 0.08 to 0.15 ppm phosphates. These you can check out his YouTube channel for purchase, and he also has a video telling you how to actually make these yourselves. These seems pretty affordable to make, but seeing how good I am with DIY, I figure I'll just buy something that's pre-made, and this is lasting me forever. Alright guys, so here it is, the 45-gallon tank after this 5 weeks of more nutrients experiments. It has been sitting at nitrate 0 and phosphate 0 for a very long time. I really did not know how much my corals were starving for these nutrients until I started dosing. Don't pay too much attention to the color, because sometimes the color is really difficult to get right. But just look at how puffy and happy some of these corals are, especially the acants. I feel like acan typically is one of the first ones for me to go. They'll just not get as puffy if the tank is quote-unquote too clean. Zoas has typically been pretty happy for me, so I think that's okay. We don't need to pay too much attention to the Zoas. And one thing I really want to test out is actually Euphyllias, because I was struggling with Euphyllias. And that is why I got this small colony of hammock coral back into this tank. And they were not doing well in the 10-gallon. And as you can see, it looks happy. Look right there. Definitely looks happier than compared to 10-gallon at least. So I feel like there's something to it. Now, granted, not all the hammock corals frags are happy, like right here. But this little frag right here has been on the way out for a while already, so I'm not too surprised. And there may be something else at play, but that's for another video. But for the most part, Euphyllias is also colored up and seems happy in this tank. Next, I'll probably move some frog spawn back into this tank to see if that was it. And like I mentioned, the Monty cap is kind of like my indicator for my nutrients. If the nutrient level is too low, it's one of the first coral for me to pout. If it's pout out, I know something is off. So that's my indicator for if things if there's not enough nutrient in the water. And Zoa is kind of my indicator for if there's too much phosphate in the water. To be fair, you probably don't really spot too much of a difference, but when you're looking at the tank every single day, around like 3 a.m. to 5 a.m., just kind of stare at it, scrutinizing every little corner of this tank, you do notice a difference. So things looks a lot happier. Just look at this little toadstool here, struggling for the longest time. Yeah, so I would say the nutrient experiment has been a success, at least in my tank. Again, the value I'm kind of sitting at right now is nitrate at 4 ppm, phosphate at 0.1 or 0.2 ppm. Initially, I was kind of chasing the red fuel ratio. That's why I was hitting up Steven on Hobby Sci, he's a genius, dude. But ultimately, before I get to 0.4 phosphate, which I feel like is a little bit high for my taste, tank is already looking awesome. So I figure, all right, you know what? 0.1 or now 0.2 is okay for me. Let's just let the tank sit here a little bit, and we're gonna get some long-term data point, and we'll take a look. We'll revisit in maybe a couple months just to see how the tank is doing. In the meantime, I am moving on to something else that I want to address for this tank. Like I mentioned, there's 3 things I'm doing, right, when I'm revamping this tank. Number 1 is coral nutrient, because I never really touch on that topic. Number 2, chemistry. I feel like the water chemistry is okay. I'm starting to do tests on alkalinity and stuff right now, but I feel like there's stuff that I could do a little better. For example, I never really introduced any of the trace elements. And then number 3, the life support, which means the lights and the flow, which I've started changing already. For those of you who are observant, you see that this is actually a Vortec MP40 versus it was Gyri in the beginning of this video. So I recently found a really good deal for a used MP40 quad drive. So I was able to hook up all these things onto Mobius, and now these pumps are actually running anti-sink mode, which is awesome. But we'll talk about it in the future. So next thing I'm gonna tackle is probably water chemistry. Water chemistry, I think for the most part, it is okay, but it could be done a little better. Now I'm trying to do a smooth transition onto a method that actually let me dose trace elements as well. So right now I'm doing BLS 2 parts, pretty much nothing else. So I am actually gonna start transitioning over to the ATI Essentials Pearl, and we'll see how that does. It'll be interesting. It's also a 2-part solution, except with this method, they do have trace as well. Oh, you know what? There's one last thing I did not touch on. This guy right here, so I put it out here, so I remember. In this video, I mentioned coral nutrient, right? So we talked about nitrate, phosphate. Didn't really touch on carbon, but I'm not carbon dosing anyway, at the moment anyways. The other thing we're supposed to talk about is the amino acid. On our market right now, there's 2 types that people really like. So the first one is the Little Fishies Acro Power. A lot of people like that, and has been around for a while. The second one is the Brightwell Amino Acids, coral amino, that I've been using for the last couple weeks as well. So this one is not sponsored or anything like that. This one is actually from after I did a lot of reading online. Seems like this is the one that people are flocking to at the moment, mainly because you do not need to refrigerate this. It just seems really easy. I have seen people dosing both this Brightwell Coral Amino as well as the Acro Power. It seems like they do something slightly different. But for me, I just want to experiment to see if it actually makes a difference. Because there's no way to really test this, so I can't really tell you whether it makes a difference or not. But just based on stories and testimonial that I hear online, it seems like this does make a difference. And it's not too expensive, so I figure why not? Let's try it. So I've been dosing this a couple weeks. So we'll see how it goes. I will continue doing this because it's not doing anything bad to the tank. And just from everything that I'm hearing, this seems to be awesome. I do like the Brightwell one simply because you don't have to refrigerate it, and it seems really easy to do every day. Just squirt something in there and we're good to go. Ideally for this one, you're supposed to shut off your skimmer for I think like 15-20 minutes after you dose. And when you dose, ideally you should dose this upstream from the coral you're trying to feed. So that's pretty much all I can say about amino acid, because again, you can't really test this, as it's kind of hard to quantify this. If you have any experience with amino acid, whether it's Brightwell or Acro Power, leave a comment, let me know. I feel like it doesn't hurt to dose, so I'll probably continue it, and it's not too expensive, so why not? Anybody looking for a belly minimax anemone? Looks like one decided to hop onto the wall, and this one would be really easy to just use a credit card to scrape off and sell or trade. Nice. All right, guys, this will do it for this video. Be on the lookout for part 2 and part 3, which is when I tackle the 45-gallon tank's chemistry as well as the life support. I think those will be really interesting video to see as well. Also, the 150-gallon tank is plumped. I did not believe this day will come before the year 2020, but apparently it's here. So be on the lookout for that as well. It's going to be a really exciting time for this channel. So if you have not already, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next Sunday at 12:30 p.m. Drop. Bye. I think it needs to move a little bit. I think I need to trim that off just a smidge. Give myself some flexibility.